Welcome to week 4 of our class, Setting the Scene in Historical Fiction. So, in this lecture, you've probably gotten a little used to me being slightly rambling and going off topic once in a while, but I'm going to be extra freeform right now because I think we're at the point where I can start talking about some of the larger things to think about in developing scenes, chapters, entire novels in historical fiction, knowing that that may not be where you're at yet. And so, these videos, they're going to stay on YouTube. So even when the class is over, if you're ever at a moment where it'll make more sense for you to rewatch this, and some of the things that I might talk about will coincide with where you are with your project at a later date, then you just come back and revisit it then. We started out talking about building the world in historical fiction, a little bit about research and concrete specific details. We went into developing the characters and the different ways that you can introduce characters into the scene. We talked about setting those characters in motion within the world of the scene. And I also talked a bit about, or maybe I talked a lot about, point of view and also verb tense, which are two things I think a lot about when I am constructing historical fiction scenes, entire novels, but the choices that are very character driven because they point of view and verb tense give you certain access to the characters, their thoughts, their actions, how far they can reflect on the past, reassurance to the reader that that character still exists somehow. If they're telling their story in the past tense, they're probably still alive, whereas present tense, that character could like stop speaking at some point. So they have very different effects. And in this fourth lecture for the class, before we move on to the week 5, where we're going to talk about workshopping and working with other writers to kind of maintain this process going forward. What happens after this class is done? Like, what can you do to create the writing life that you envision for yourself? So that'll be more in week 5 when we talk about workshopping. So today I'm going to touch on some of the larger things where you're going from the scene, building it out maybe to the chapter level, thinking about plot, thinking about the purpose of a scene or a chapter, some of the elements like mood and foreshadowing, and the ultimate effect that you are trying to achieve in a particular piece of creative nonfiction that you're writing. So again, I'll be referring to the first chapter, chapter 1 from Orphan Number 8, which is available free online from the link you'll find below. And I'll refer to some of my other books or some other things as they come to mind. This first chapter of Orphan 8 now, we've gone to school on it in a number of ways. And not to aggrandize my own work, but more as an example of how you can do this with a novel that you find inspiring. A novel where you're like, wow, if only I could write like that. Well, you can go to school on it the way we've been going to school on the first chapter of Orphan Number 8 and kind of figure out how does it work? How does it do what it is that you like so much about it? I remember Colm Toybeen's Brooklyn is very close third person. And I mentioned in my last video when I was when I was writing chapters in third person more omniscient, I reread Bel Canto by Ann Patchett because she does that so incredibly well. It's really amazing. In Brooklyn, what he achieves is an extremely close third person. And I was like, how did he do that? Because I was struggling. I didn't want to do first person. I didn't want the character to speak in their own voice for themselves. I wanted to have that little bit of a distance to be able to say some things about that character as the narrator. But how do you make that close third person? Like, how do you go in their mind? How do you keep it all from their point of view? And so I took out a highlighter pen and I reread Brooklyn and just looked for the places where that was happening. And what I found was a lot of just little things. She wondered, she thought, not necessarily a huge variety in the way that was happening, but just dropping it in enough so that you're almost unconscious of it as you're reading. But these finding the strategies that he used to accomplish that. So again, by using this first chapter of Orphan, number 8, more than anything, what I'd like you to take away from it is the way you can approach going to school on something you choose that is really inspiring, a good model for you. So I've talked a little before, what is the purpose of chapter 1? Because it is odd. We meet characters who will run away or die by the end of the chapter, which is weird in the first chapter of a novel. We don't focus as much on the little girl, Rachel Rabinowitz, who will be the main character of this entire novel. And in fact, in chapter 2, we're going to meet Rachel Rabinowitz, all grown up, in her 40s, working as a nurse. I'm going to pick her up at that point. So we're like, it is a little unsettling, maybe. We're often used to fiction being pretty clear. Where's our point of view? Who's our main character? But you can futz with that. If it works, it works. I remember in school the first time I read Moby Dick thinking, oh, that's multiple points of view. You can't do that, because I'd just gotten out of high school and so I knew everything about how to write. And of course, it's if it works, if it's successful, if you know what you're doing, if you understand your purpose in doing it. In my third novel that's coming out next summer, Counting Lost Stars, there's a chapter pretty late in the novel. We've been 2 points of view alternating for, I don't know, 300 pages. And all of a sudden, this other thing comes in the a chapter where you would expect Cornelia Vogel, the Dutch character who alternates with Rita Klein, the American character. You expect a Cornelia chapter, and instead we get a report. So in the previous Cornelia chapter, it's World War II, it's during the Holocaust, and Cornelia's on a train to Bergen-Belsen. And that's the last chapter just on Cornelia for a while. The next chapter that would alternate, where you'd expect a Cornelia chapter, instead I have this fictional thing I made up that's a report from like an aid worker who was at Bergen-Belsen after the liberation and was helping survivors, and who then met Cornelia and is sort of this person, this other character, Edith, is writing this report about her encounter with Cornelia at Bergen-Belsen after liberation. And for me, and my editor, she asked me, she's like, this is a little weird. We have a new point of view. Should we have other points of view to balance it out? And I said, no, because even though it's odd to make that change all of a sudden, the reasons I had for doing it were, I did not want to write a close third person, present tense, point of view chapter at Bergen-Belsen under Nazi concentration camp. I just didn't want to do it. If you have any sense of history, you know. Bergen-Belsen had its own uniquenesses, but we understand what's about to happen. I didn't want to dwell. It's just horror. I wanted to pick it up after liberation. I wanted there to be a reflection back on it, but by constructing this report by this aid worker, Edith, it's the tone is a little more like business-like. So it's a big change. It's weird. And it happens in Counting Lost Stars. And then we have a Rita chapter, which was like, okay, Rita, Cornelia, Rita, this strange report about Bergen-Belsen, but it's about Cornelia, back to Rita. And then the next chapter after that, what's happening in Counting Lost Stars in terms of the plot of this book, which is part of what I want to talk about today. In terms of the plot, I've had two different points of view, two different characters, Rita Klein, Cornelia Vogel. Rita Klein, it's 1960 New York City. Cornelia Vogel, it's 1940s Nazi-occupied Netherlands. And we're getting hints that there's, you read in the novel, you're thinking they must somehow come together, because why is the author giving me these two different things? And so part of what can create a sense of tension, anticipation in a novel when you have two very different points of view is this expectation by the reader that somehow they're going to come together, that we are going to begin to integrate these two points of view, that they'll influence each other or reflect each other somehow, that there's going to be a payoff, that you're not reading two novels that I just cut up in pieces and spliced together, that we're reading one novel, and that the plot is going to bring these two things, these two very different narratives together. And so by changing the point of view at this chapter where I have this aid worker, Edith, writing a report about finding Cornelia, meeting her at Bergen-Belsen after liberation, I break the pattern in some ways, and yet that report is in the place in the book where you would have expected a chapter about Cornelia Vogel. Then we go back to Rita Klein. And this is the point in the novel where the two different time periods, the two different characters, the two different narratives are now going to come together. And so I have Rita Klein reach out in her time period, 1960 New York, to Edith, who lives in New York, who wrote that report. Rita Klein has read this report and she wants to know more, and she calls the aid organization where Edith works, which is still, in business. It's 15 years after the end of World War II, and asked to speak to the woman who wrote that report. This woman is now 40 years old. She lives in New York. And so Rita Klein, in her chapter, is going to meet Edith, who knew Cornelia at the liberation of Bergen-Belsen. So these, in terms of how this plot is coming together, this is something I pretty much had in mind the entire time I was writing Counting Lost Stars. And so we go from the chapter where Rita is like, I'm going to call this woman Edith and see what else I can find out. At the end of that chapter, Rita walks away. And the very next chapter, again, in the place where I've taught you through the way I've organized the novel to expect a chapter, close third person, about Cornelia Vogel. Instead, Edith. It's Edith. The point of view shifts to Edith. It's still close third person, except now it's Edith. It's still present tense, so I'm maintaining the verb tense as a through line. But what's going to start to happen with these third person chapters is they're sort of two narratives, two main characters in each. So I have these four characters are all going to start to meet. And like that paragraph I read to you last time, where decades earlier, Cornelia is thinking about these computers and how would someone from the future find meaning in these punch cards with these holes. You'd need a code book, you'd need a computer, you'd need all these different things to come together in order to find meaning in these punch cards. Well, that's what's happening in the plot of Counting Lost Stars. I have the four characters are going to come together. Rita Klein understands how to process computers in 1960 New York City. The man she's fallen in love with, Jacob, his mother was lost to him during the Holocaust, and he's the one who wants the information, what happened to her. Edith is the one who wrote this report that Rita was able to find, and so she's like the bridge, she's the hinge that connects Rita to Cornelia. And then we go from there to finding out that Cornelia, since the war, sorry when you read this book, because you'll know a little bit about, I'm kind of all spoilers here, but that's the point of this lecture. Um, Cornelia is living in New York City. And Cornelia has the codes. Jacob has the question. Rita knows how to process computers. Edith has saved the cards. And Cornelia still knows the codes. So the paragraph I read you last time basically foreshadowed the entire plot of Counting Lost Stars. But the reader doesn't know that when they encounter that paragraph on like page 90 something. But it sits in the back of the reader's mind. You teach the reader, how does this world work? And what is it going to take to solve things, to discover things, to fall in love, to find justice, to right wrongs, whatever it is that the people in your novel are trying to do, the characters are trying to do. So I shift this point of view, and now my third person chapters, now everybody's together. So my third person chapters are now able to look at Edith and Cornelia and Jacob and Rita, because now they're all together. But we still are now going back and forth to just the Rita first person point of view chapters, because she has her own thing she needs to solve. And the plot of the novel, in bringing this group of people together to find out what happened to Jacob's mother during the Holocaust, using these computer punch cards, bringing them together, solves the question that Rita Klein has carried through this whole narrative. She's trying to figure something out. And so it's a very complicated plot. I love plot. And some writers are not big planners. Some writers they say they write by the seat of their pants. And some writers have a big chart on the wall. Either way, however you approach it, a reader is going to expect some sense of plot. Now, not everything. Some things are very lyric, some things are very literary, some things have they're more fragmented, that the connections are more like, I don't know, like echoes or resonances. But most historical fiction novels are going to have a plot. And at the beginning of the novel, you'll have a sense of what it is the main character is worried about, concerned for, wants, needs to make happen. Questions will be raised. Those questions will be resolved somehow. And at the end of the novel, the effect I enjoy when I'm reading most fiction, and the effect I'm trying to achieve is the sense that it's surprising yet inevitable. So a little short of like a crazy twist, like, oh my God, I never saw that coming. I do want a reader to be a little surprised, like, oh, but not like, oh my God. And then also think like, oh, of course. So different from a mystery where you're like, ooh, who did it? I knew it. I figured it out. It's not that kind of inevitable, but a sense that if you're a reader who's been engaged, you're guessing, you're forecasting in your own mind what you think is going to happen. You're noticing connections that maybe the characters haven't noticed yet. And so when you get to the conclusion where all the things come together, you're like, oh. You think about Shakespeare comedy, romantic comedy. The idea of comedy is that in the end, differences are resolved and there's union. And, in a romantic comedy, you're like, here's the lead, here's the other lead. They are going to get together. But how? And there's pleasure in reading along and see this is in their way. This is they're together and then they break up or something. Like, how are they going to get together? I think about Twelfth Night, Shakespeare's Twelfth Night, which I reference actually quite a bit. I like to talk about Shakespeare in every book I write, I guess. The English major in me. Um, and there's this sense that, everything is out of whack. A Midsummer Night's Dream, everything is out of whack, and it's going to fall into place again. Um, and for me, that's the sort of the sense of plot. That the other thing that I think about with plot is um, the inciting incident. So this is different in fiction than in playwriting. I know a couple of the people in the class are playwriting or screenwriting. In playwriting, the inciting incident, the thing that happened that starts the story in motion that needs to be resolved somehow. Usually in playwriting, it has happened. You think about Hamlet. His dad is dead already. That's not part of Hamlet. The king is already dead. The question for Hamlet through the whole play is, what am I going to do about it? Am I going to do something about it? What should I do about it? And it's tragic, so everybody's dead at the end. But the inciting incident that starts Hamlet on this quest of what am I supposed to do has happened. In a novel, usually, and there's no rule about this, but typically the inciting incident, that's where we come in. That's why the entire first chapter of Orphan Number 8 is how Visha Rabinowitz dies. How does someone become an orphan? If they had a family, they have parents. This is what happens that changes her fate. And I could have started, the book a chapter later. It could have been like, here's this little orphan, and there's, her parents just died, and now what happens next? But I really wanted the reader to come into this novel, Orphan Number 8, with this feeling, like I said last time, what it is she lost, so that you can grieve with her, with Rachel, and you know what it is she lost. And also with a sense of different family situations that in the early 20th century led kids to being placed in institutions. It wasn't the Hebrew Orphan Asylum that was the inspiration for Orphan Number 8. Most of the kids there had a living parent. Many of them had a living parent or other living relatives who maintained contact with them, but who could not, for one reason or another, take care of them. And so these orphanages were not really about adopting kids out to families. They were really about, they were kind of like boarding schools for kids without families. So the chapter number 1 in Orphan Number 8 has a purpose in giving you a sense of Rachel's family, who she was as a little person, as a child before the calamity befell her family, giving the reader an insight into here's a particular calamity that befell a family, other calamities could befall families, establishing that Rachel isn't a true orphan. Her father lives, but he's such a schmuck that he's run away and left his little children behind. And we're introduced to the world she's coming from. I really wanted to write about the Lower East Side tenement immigrant experience. So that's the purpose of the first chapter. But it does set up a few little themes. As I talked last time about developing the characters, you get a sense, you get the basic sense of the characters, and that you will see develop as things go on. Pretty much managed to lose my train of thought. Let me come back. I talked a lot about overall plot and structure a bit in terms of the alternating chapters and changing point of view in service of the story and the plot. Even though that was a little unconventional, my editor was kind of like, I like it, but I don't know if I'm supposed to like it. Is it okay? And I'm like, I really like it. And I knew why I was doing it, and I think it's working. In Orphan Number 8, the plot of the book is how Rachel Rabinowitz, who was orphaned as a child, which now you know all about that, she's going to end up in this institution of Hebrew orphanages, infant asylums, and uh, children's homes, um, where, as really did happen, pediatricians often use the children as subjects for medical research. And in the plot of Orphan Number 8, in the chapters that follow Rachel through her childhood, we're going to see this happen. We've seen her lose her family. We're going to see her placed in the infant asylum. We're going to see her chosen as a research subject by Dr. Mildred Solomon, a woman which was inspired by, there was a real woman named Dr. Elsie Fox who worked at the Hebrew Infant Home, who did medical research on children under Dr. Alfred Hess, who was the head pediatrician there. So Rachel's going to be chosen for this research. We're going to see the effect that the experimental, it's using x-rays, which were a new cool thing in the 1920s. It's going to be a medical experiment using x-rays. It's going to damage her, the effect on her, and then how that the damage to her sort of shapes the rest of her childhood experience as she goes to this other orphanage. She's reunited with her brother, who now feels even worse than ever. First of all, he couldn't help protect her from being sent to a different orphanage. He had no power whatsoever to keep her safe from these medical experiments. And now here's Rachel back in the orphanage where Sam was placed originally, because he's a little older, and she's damaged, and how is he gonna, he feels bad, but it's not, he couldn't do anything about it. So again, you see these elements of their character following through. But Rachel is not going to be a simple person that you root for. She's going to sometimes be sneaky. She's going to lie. She's going to take a little bit of revenge on one of the girls who bullies her. She's going to take advantage of another girl who really likes her. In following her compulsion to find Sam after he's run away, and maybe even be reunited with their father, who she thinks maybe could still help her. So those chapters are following that plot. But the key plot of Orphan Number 8 is about the adult version of Rachel meeting this Dr. Mildred Solomon again, when Rachel is an adult working as a nurse in a home, the Hebrew Home for the Aged, I think I call it, where Dr. Mildred Solomon is now the patient because she's dying of cancer, probably caused by working with all these x-rays. And that encounter is what will trigger Rachel to revisit her childhood and be in a position, finally, as an adult, a position of power over this doctor who subjected her to medical experiments. And there'll be one long night at the Home for the Aged where Rachel comes very close to taking revenge. So that concept, first of all, this was the first novel I wrote, and I really didn't know what I was doing for a number of years. And the aspects of the plot, the key thrust of the novel really developed as it went along. And then as I could see the protagonist and the antagonist and the main conflicts developing, I could then go back and revise and build that up and have a much clearer through line to those things. With my most recent book, Counting Lost Stars, that in many, many ways that I knew the whole plot of the book before I even started. And that's the way I go about it. I need for me to have the courage to start down this road of writing. I tend to write 125,000 words. My novels are about 400 pages long. It's a lot, and it's drafting is really hard for me. I always feel like I'm not writing enough. I never feel disciplined enough. Apparently, I'm able to do it, so I try not to be too hard on myself. But the thing that gives me the courage to draft the novel to get it to the point where I can be like, oh, now I'm in my sweet spot. Now I can revise and edit and workshop and revise and edit and workshop more, move things around, fix things, you know, fiddle with metaphors. I mean, that's the part of the writing I love. The drafting is unsettling for me because it's like unknown, and you have to be open to being surprised because things will come up that you don't expect. But having that overarching plot gives me the courage to go through. And with Counting Lost Stars, I did end up hitting all the key main plot points I envisioned before I even started writing it. I ended up hitting them. Some of them took a little longer to get to. Things developed. It raised questions. The one key scene, I had to revise many times until I could get it to like feel organic and like it was really working. So, what do you do if you're thinking of a big project? Do you have an overall sense of plot? Sometimes with historical fiction, because you're basing it on a real character or a real historical series of events, the plot is kind of given to you. This is what happened. In my second novel, Bachelor Girl, Colonel Jacob Rupert, when he died, he really did leave a huge fortune and part ownership of the New York Yankees to an unmarried actress named Helen. And nobody understood why. And that was the starting point for my imagination, but the plot had to go there. That was the real thing that happened, that I was then writing fiction around. So sometimes the historical thing gives you the main plot, and sometimes you're kind of inventing it. With Counting Lost Stars, elements, all the elements were real. They did have computers. Nazis loved punch card computers. The entire concentration camp system was organized using punch card computers, which is part of the reason that the Holocaust in Europe was so devastating. It was very efficient. It was organized with computer technology, an early kind of computer technology. That was real. That was really inspiring, but the overall plot was very much my invention. So wherever you're coming from in terms of that overall plot, if it's helpful to you to have that overarching outline, where do we begin? Where do we end? What are some of the key things that have to happen? Key moments, key encounters between characters. Something happens that moves the character out of this one world and into another world. They go on a quest. They search for something. They, find each other. They have a question. They unearth the answer. If that's helpful for you, that's helpful for me. But even if you start that way, it doesn't mean you're not going to revise your novel many, many times and change and fix things and move things around. So if it feels more generative for you, if it feels more natural and inviting for you to just sit down and start writing, you may be worried like, oh, if I don't know where it's going, it's going to create so much extra work later. You're going to have so much extra work later. It doesn't matter how you begin. I envy people who can just sit down and say, I'm just going to write and see what happens. I mean, I have an idea. I have a sense of who the character is. I kind of know where we are. Let's just see what unfolds. And they still have to revise and edit, but they seem very happy about it. And so either way, whatever way works for you, don't feel like you have to plot things out ahead before you can start writing. For some people, that just becomes such a huge thing that you never get to the writing. For me, my plotting is pretty much of an outline. It's not super detailed, kind of. And then the writing like develops and pushes against that and kind of stretches it out. But I found in the way that I approach writing that it tends to work. However you begin, just writing or plotting first and then writing. Like I said, you're going to have to come back and revise. You're going to edit. It's inevitable. It really helps to know for me, and again, this may be more in the revising thing, the purpose of a chapter, the purpose of a scene. When you're in the revision editing stage, understanding what does this chapter, what does the scene need to accomplish for the reader and for the story. What does the reader need to get from this scene, from this chapter, in order to advance this story? That will help you make so many decisions: what you keep, what you don't, what you develop, what you edit out. And I've talked about that a bit with the first chapter of Orphan Number 8. What I want the reader to get from that chapter, why I want the reader to spend time with people who will never show up in this novel again, which is a little weird for novels, but the reason for it, and then hopefully then it begins to pay off. I talked about arriving at a place that feels surprising yet inevitable. I think about the end of Portrait of a Lady by Henry James, where he's I'm not going to remember her character's name, the main character, this woman. He's developed this character in a way where there really can only be one decision she makes at the end, which is to stay with this horrible idiot she's married for all the wrong reasons, and not run away with somebody else because it would hurt a young person's future. And everything you know about that character, the main character of Portrait of a Lady, whose name I'm forgetting, leads you to that's an inevitable conclusion. But I get to the end of the Henry James novel, and I'm not like surprised, and yet like, oh wow. But of course, I'm just like, why did I read this whole novel if she's just gonna stay with this idiot? So it's inevitable and frustrating. So aiming for surprising yet inevitable is a different effect. As soon as the question raised by the inciting incident, which I think I started talking about a long time ago and veered off into Hamlet, in the novel, the inciting incident is where you drop in on the story. You see it happen. I'm thinking about State of Wonder by Ann Patchett, and I think the opening line is something like, "The blue airmail envelope arrived." And the whole plot of that novel, State of Wonder, is the research scientist needs to find what happened to her research partner who went to the Amazon to check up on this research project their company's funding. Her personal situation is she's single in her 40s. What is she going to do with her personal life? And that also, at the end of the novel, there's a very strong suggestion of what is going to happen next for her without spelling it out. Your novel ends when the question raised by the inciting incident has been answered. So in Orphan Number 8, by the time we're at the end of chapter 2, we know that Rachel Rabinowitz, as a grown-up, is going to meet Dr. Solomon, and she's going to have to decide what to do about that. Is she going to take revenge? Is she going to find a way to forgive this woman who experimented on her as a kid and really damaged her? As soon as that is really resolved, the question of the novel has been answered, and a few other things get tied up. But a lot of people, after they read Orphan Number 8, they're like, oh, what happened next? Like, did she do this? Did this happen? What happened with this? And like, I have an idea in my head, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. So as you think about the overall plot of a novel, as you think about how to begin, where you're going, achieving, again, an aesthetic experience for the reader that they can't get in the sort of random, unknowable life that we all lead. It's this feeling of things coming together. One of the ways you help the reader and give them pleasure as they work from this inciting incident towards the surprising yet inevitable conclusion is through foreshadowing, giving the reader little things to like notice, planting little seeds in the back of the reader's mind. This is why rereading a novel that you enjoyed can be unbelievably helpful for you as a writer. When I reread State of Wonder, I was noticing like she practically telegraphs the entire thing right there. But the first time through, I don't notice that because I don't know like that sentence is the key thing. In the paragraph from Counting Lost Stars I read to you last time, where Cornelia's at work with these computers and she's thinking about the punch cards and how they're like meaningless unless you have codes in a computer. Even if someone from the future put it all together, what would it mean? You don't know when you read that paragraph that that's like the outline of the whole plot, that this is foreshadowing how this whole book is going to come together. But it pays off later when they're saying, well, I have a computer. Well, I have the punch cards. Well, I have the codes. Well, I have a question. And you know, oh, those are all the things you need to come together. So foreshadowing, again, like almost everything else, allow it to arise as you draft, but it really happens more in the revision and editing. Is it in the right place? Is it too much? Is it not enough? The mood of a piece, is it dark? Is it funny? Is it light? There's usually like one place in my novels where people laugh, maybe two. I wish I had more of those. I wish I had more moments that were like, where you'd be like, haha, I love a novel like that. I tend to pick pretty serious subjects. But you can, I think mood and then bigger things like theme, these are things that I can't plan ahead for. I can outline a plot. These things are going to happen. I can, as I'm revising, sort of make sure, oh, that foreshadows things. It fits best here. I can move it here, something like that. I can have a sense that we're heading towards a surprising yet inevitable conclusion. I can understand, like, here's where the story needs to start, because this is what's going to set us off. But theme and mood, things like that, I think you really have to trust your own unconscious. The kind of work, if you were ever an English major and you had to analyze things back in the new critical way that I was trained in, where you're looking for little like hints and clues and like it's almost like little puzzle pieces. Believe me, most authors don't plan all that stuff. They're not aware of that. They're not like, oh, I'll put this here so an English major can write a paper about it someday. It arises. Because we are writers, because we are readers, because we pay attention, because we like structure and plot and character and setting, and we think about all these things, theme and mood will arise. And once they reveal themselves to you, and you go back and you're doing another one of those many revisions and edits, it's the sort of thing that you can like emphasize a bit here and there. As you begin to notice it, you're like, oh, look at that. I've told you I write in usually they're alternating chapters of something changes, point of view, character, or something different is in each chapter. So where the one chapter goes to the next, I'm usually really fixated on where in the plot are we? Like, how is this moving along an overall plot? But sometimes I'll see where one chapter ends and the next chapter begins, and like, I'll be surprised. I'm like, oh, look, how this thing that happened in that chapter is like reflecting what's happening in the next chapter. I didn't plan it. I didn't even know I was doing it, and I didn't even notice it until later. So if I can come back to chapter 1 of Orphan 8 for a couple of tiny concrete examples to maybe like anchor this long ramble into something that you can look at in terms of foreshadowing. I told you about the purpose of the chapter and how it fits in the overall structure of the book. Right on page 1, you know it makes me nervous when there's too many people crowding in the kitchen. Well, this is how Visha's going to die by the end of chapter 1. All these people are crowding in this one kitchen. Harry is back. He's fighting with Visha. Rachel is hanging on Visha. Sam is fighting with his dad. Their neighbor is in the doorway. 5 people in this one little room, and tragedy is going to happen, kind of accidentally, but also because Harry is a terrible guy. Right there in the first page. Makes me nervous when there's too many people crowding in the kitchen. That's going to happen. There's a moment at the bottom of page 5, one of these moments that's foreshadowing. It's a term I learned from watching a film studies lecture. This is the sense of a repeated image, which you notice in film, and you see it in writing as well. So at the bottom of page 5, Rachel puts her hands on Visha's cheeks to get her mother's attention. Visha gazed at her reflection in her daughter's dark eyes. When we get to the end of the chapter, this is going to be reversed. Visha is dying, and Rachel is going to look into her mother's eyes. On page 7, Harry says the contractor likes my cutting because I don't leave much scrap, and that's going to be evoked at the very end of the chapter where Harry's like, he doesn't waste any scrap on sentiment. He's like, I'm out of here. There's a plot point. The main, I think, sort of driver of like action in this chapter is in terms of like big stuff that happens. The early pages revealing the setting, the world, the characters, but then Harry forgets his lunch. And it's because Harry forgot his lunch, and because little Rachel feels responsible for it, and because we know that Rachel sometimes throws tantrums that drive her mom, into fits of anxiety. And so all this has prepared us for Visha making a choice, a decision that's going to move our plot. Visha says, we'll take the lunch to him at the factory. Harry's told her, I don't want you to come to the factory. But she's like, I'm going to take the lunch. And so this missing lunch becomes a big plot point, which you don't know until you get to the factory. And then here's that moment where the reader sees right away on page 14, bottom of 14, top of 15, Harry sees his wife Visha and Rachel coming across the factory floor. His eyes darted over Visha's shoulder to one of the sewing machine operators, a pretty girl with a lace collar buttoned up to her neck. She met his gaze, hands frozen at the machine, her cheeks gone white. And then the reader's like, obviously there's something between Harry and this girl. No wonder Harry doesn't want Visha coming to the factory. Maybe we're starting to suspect all these stories about Harry being out late and staying late at work are kind of false. We see this girl again when Visha is leaving. Again, a little plot thing happens at the bottom of 15. Visha and Rachel can't get back on the elevator because it's full. There are bins full of scrap, which was a true thing that would happen. So they have to go down the stairs, and they encounter this girl at the top of page 16. And Visha's like, why is this girl crying? And later, when the pickle man asks Rachel, how was the factory? Rachel says, oh, it's not nice. It makes girls cry. And so the reader is noticing this. And I'm not trying to make this hugely mysterious. It's like the reader's like, oh, something's going on. And so when Francesca and her mother show up at Visha's apartment, and they say, Harry said he would marry her, you kind of see it coming. And in fact, if you look back at page 18 to 19, the reader now knows something's wrong. They know Harry's got something going with this girl, that seeing Visha showing up made this girl, Francesca, cry. But we have a couple of pages here where sort of nothing is happening. But there's tension because the reader is waiting. The reader knows something's going to go on. But page 18, Sam comes home for lunch, and now we have a quiet afternoon at the apartment, at home at the tenement apartment. The insurance man comes. This is a plot thing that's not going to pay off for like 300 more pages. You're going to completely forget that this ever happened. God forbid anything should happen, Visha said to the insurance man, bottom of 18. For now, all we got money for is their papa and me. So Visha and Harry have life insurance on themselves, the children as their beneficiaries. I don't know what page it's on, but way later, way later, Rachel will have stolen some money to fund running away from the orphanage so she can find Sam and find their father, all of which does not turn out the way she wants. And she stole that money from the one person, the one girl at the orphanage who's always been supportive and wonderful and actually in love with her. How can she make that right? I mean, how can you ever make that right? Like, I lied to you, I used you, I stole from you. Um, Hi, it's me. And unbeknownst to Rachel, this teeny inheritance has been on her account at the orphanage for like 300 pages of this novel, um, just waiting to like solve that problem. So again, a reader's not going to know that, but and I don't really know. When I wrote The Insurance Man, I think I was mostly thinking about the scene from, like I said, A Tree Grows in Brooklyn. And then later, maybe it occurred to me like, oh, wait, I could use the insurance money to fix this problem she's created. So, in terms of plot, little things like that that seem really neat, like little foreshadowing that pays off hundreds of pages later, you achieve that as you write. Uh, don't weigh yourself down thinking you have to think every little thing through, because you cannot. It is impossible. Maybe not for other people. It is impossible for me and most writers I know. Um, but once you know, you can always go back and like make sure that these little things line up. So that's a huge plot point at the bottom of 18, the insurance, and you won't know it for hundreds of pages. Middle of page 19, the afternoon would be quiet for a while now, the hush in the room made more special by the noise seeping in from the street below. Oh, if only, but the reader knows already everything's about to fall apart because they know about Harry. And now the girl shows up with her mother. Visha finds out Harry is a liar. She understands on the middle of page 21. The truth clicked into place like the tumblers of a lock. There were no societies. There was no savings. Harry had been out with this girl, spending his money on her, and Visha left at home to make soup out of bones, which we've seen her do. So just within the chapter, this is the plot, the little mini plot within the chapter. And now Harry is like supposed to help out Francesca. She needs money to go away. To hide her pregnancy and give her baby up for adoption. In my own family history, that's the story that was passed down to me from my great-grandmother, that when her husband ran off and left her so that she had to put her sons, including my grandpa, into the Hebrew orphan asylum, he'd gotten a girl pregnant that worked for him. And so my whole life, I don't know. I've never done the Ancestry DNA because I'm suspicious of databases, especially after researching and writing this about how Nazis love their databases. But who knows? Maybe out in the world somewhere is like this like third cousin of mine from Harry's. My great grandpa was named Harry. That's where this name comes from. So it seems like life and fiction are coinciding. In terms of little plot points, we have the knife in the sink, the knife that she's cutting things up with, because that's going to be the weapon that ends her life. And then that recurring image at the end of 25, where Rachel is like, put her hands on her mother's cheeks. So we have that recurring image. So these are a lot of the things. So many things happen when you're writing, especially in a larger scale like a novel, but even in a smaller space if you're writing a scene. They happen for the reader kind of all at once. As the writer, you learn for yourself what's the best way to get yourself started. Is it a plan? Like I said, I research enough to know what kind of story I can write. Then I do like a plot outline, and then I start drafting, and I know that so much is going to change later. That's when it gets really good. It's the first draft. I'm always like, oh wait, this time did I write a first draft and I'm done? No, of course not. Never. It will always take a lot of revision and workshopping and editing and revising, and that's okay. That's what writing is. It's a friend I used to work with when I was teaching writing. She called it a spiral curriculum. When you're teaching writing, you're kind of always teaching the same things over and over again. But as you develop as a writer and you are open to and able to use more the information differently and apply it differently, you just like hear it over and over again. So, key, you have an idea, you want to write it. What we'll talk about next week more in terms of workshopping and process. How do you do it? How do you get from I have this great idea to um, I wrote this book? How do you get from here to there? And so those are the things we'll talk about next week in more like process. So I hope that there were some things that I rambled on about today that were helpful for you. Again, find the book that it's like that's the model for you, and you go to school on it, and you'll see these things that I've been talking about. All right, that's enough for now. Next week, we'll start to bring all these things together.